So I just finished the 4-episode premiere of Frieren Beyond Journey's End. This show was billed to me as basically a sad fantasy show about a cute semi-immortal elf girl watching all her friends slowly die, specifically after they beat the Demon Lord. If it seems like I'm spoiling things already, rest assured that this premise is firmly established within the first episode. I think the show does a great job of setting proper expectations early in this way, which is something I've grown to greatly appreciate over the years. While the description of a fantastical tragedy is fairly accurate on the surface, what I found most interesting was the fairly unique execution of that appeal, and how I responded to it emotionally over the course of these 4 episodes. As far as all the pivotal emotional moments that are clearly supposed to give me the big sad are concerned, things aren't handled with the same saccharine or over-the-top approach that many shows tackling the same subject matter or themes would. The show often chooses not to play things up in this way. However, I think that goes beyond simply being subtle. Breathtaking and even tragic events are sudden, often relatively unceremonious, and some might even say clinical. Perhaps this is simply meant to portray death as a natural course of life, but I do think it's deeper than that, or can at least be appreciated at other levels thanks to these subtleties. I actually didn't even like this element of the show at first. I could feel my admittedly jaded emotions just sort of glazing over. I felt like the work wasn't being done to make me empathize with these situations. She's crying. Shouldn't I be crying right now? Shouldn't you be trying harder to make me cry while she's experiencing her first pivotal moment of loss? Shouldn't you drag this scene out as the music swells to a peak? Shouldn't there have been more specific characterization done to the character who just departed? However, I 100% believe that I was the fool in this regard. This scene is short-lived. There is no music, only the sound of the shovel tossing dirt onto the coffin as it's lowered into the ground. Frieren immediately resumes her journey, and it will be a long time before she fully processes her emotions, or we find out through any reminiscent flashbacks exactly who Himmel was to her. This is very intentional. Although I personally think that this approach takes some of the immediate sting away from just such moments and their relevant emotions, the longer I watched, the more I actually found it perfectly befitting of the character the story being told revolves around. Frieren is a stoic and fairly withdrawn character, and because she's an elf, she has and will live an unimaginably long life. Therefore, it actually makes sense that these events are handled with a more subdued and fairly unceremonious approach. Things happen suddenly, often without much fanfare, just the same way that she herself would likely perceive them given her broad perception of the nonetheless unyielding passage of time. Another thing I love about this subtle and unceremonious approach to tragedy and pathos is that I think it'll pay off more long-term than immediately. I believe this will likely make more emotional moments down the line that much more impactful. When an event that breaks down a more emotionally experienced version of Frieren arrives, I think it's going to hit me that much harder, in a way which is that much more relatable to her personal experience. As I'll talk about a little more near the end, I also think this approach leaves lots of room for reframing these earlier events as we learn more about her party and her previous journey. Anyway, let's talk about it. Keeping in mind that I'm anime only, what's it actually about? What do I thus far think it has to say? And what other shows could I recommend by way of it, or vice versa? I've heard some comparisons to Mushoku Tensei, but I would argue those are basically only as deep as aesthetic, magic, fantasy lore, and world building stuff. Tonally, perhaps it shares some similarities, but also many more huge differences. In my opinion, it's much more reminiscent of something like Mushishi than anything else I can think of. If you're into Mushishi, or would like an Iyashike in the vein of something like Aria the Animation, but with a side of depression, check it out. To Your Eternity might also be an apt comparison, but I'm embarrassed to admit that I've had it on hold for a while now. While it tackles what is traditionally heavy subject matter, it does so in a very calm and relaxing way. At its core, I think Frieren is about accepting the impermanence of life, and how death and the unyielding passage of time affect people. Frieren begins the story having already defeated the Demon King as part of the hero's party. She sets out on, or perhaps more accurately, resumes a journey, chasing her desire to continue collecting as many spells as possible. This journey, whether she fully realizes it or not, is one of self-discovery as well as one meant to help her better understand the comrades whose importance she did not fully comprehend before. She spends a lot of time indulging her hobby of collecting spells, but also retracing the journey she once took with those comrades to recollect and rediscover what will come to be cherished memories of both past and present. Time passes quickly on this journey, but there's a subtlety with which the show portrays Frieren herself as moving slowly through life, which I feel also does a great job of showing showing her perception of time. There are few times throughout these episodes where she shows much urgency at all. Many shows would of course not provide this type of information through such a consistent and subtle show-don't-tell approach. The same subtlety is executed on through the montage of her little journey after the hero's journey, before coming back to see her comrades for the first time. This entirely voiceless scene begins with a single shot of this river, followed immediately by a time lapse that speeds up until it begins flashing through seasons within seconds. And this same shopkeeper, who was only shown briefly near the beginning, is shown to have clearly aged up decades just after the montage. The show hasn't gotten me to cry yet, despite all the comments online from people who have. However, I can tell the themes are affecting me, simply by how they've seeped their way into my consciousness and had me thinking about family, friends, and nostalgic memories more outside of the show. In short, the themes hit hard and the show is highly relatable. I haven't experienced such a cozy, relaxing, existential crisis in a long time. A look at this story would of course not be complete without a look at Frieren herself. You might have noticed many of the characters' names, including Frieren's, are in German. I'm literally quoting a YouTube comment here, so don't quote me, but I thought this was fascinating commentary from a German viewer. Quote, "The German language provides us with insights into our characters, offering subtle nuances that enrich their characterization. Frieren, denoting the concept of freezing or experiencing coldness, intriguingly aligns with her demeanor, marked by an air of detachment, introversion, and aloofness. Furthermore, it symbolizes her timeless existence, akin to being suspended in an unchanging state due to her extended lifespan." End quote. Here's the rest of the comment in case you're interested. To quote her companions, her apprentice Fern refers to her as hopelessly dense and says she doesn't understand people's feelings, while her former comrade Eisen later calls her indifferent. While I referred to Frieren as stoic and withdrawn, that's not to say that she's emotionless or without genuine interest. It's also not to say that she's not kind to or curious about other people. As it turns out, she's kinder than she herself even seems to realize. Perhaps more interesting is that she's actually quite quirky and aloof beneath the mostly cold and unchanging surface. During this flashback montage, Fern recalls many memories of Frieren blowing their funds on strange items, such as a potion that only dissolves clothing. Meanwhile, she has Fern handle the actual necessities like food and water. Later in the same episode, when she notices how much Fern has grown, she pats her own chest and states, "Our diets are mostly the same, so it can't be that. How strange." Just before the camera cuts to these two stacks of rocks.
With metaphor, the qualities of one thing are figuratively carried over to another.
I guess those parts are actually fairly Mushoku Tensei-like. However, jokes like this aside, as beautiful as Frieren is, she seems basically sexless, as indifferent to being upskirted by this kid, or Himel's anguished cries of envy as she is to anything else. She's also hopelessly bad at waking early and tidying up, which is definitely relatable and adds to her aloof quirkiness, but also further illustrates her timelessness, indifference, and lack of urgency. She repeatedly states that she only enjoys magic somewhat, but nonetheless indulges her hobby of collecting spells seemingly to no end, and always seems exceedingly proud of herself when a spell works out to help others. As you can see, she's actually quite the character. She's quirky, aloof, spontaneous, dense, untidy, unhurried, indifferent, and in a sense, perhaps even a bit selfish by her own admission. Her most frequently repeated phrase has thus far been, "I'm doing this for myself." Whether she's in denial or experiencing a more altruistic version of selfishness, helping others to help herself and vice versa, this is her answer when she's frequently asked why she's helping people, why she's checking in on and picking up after her former comrades' obligations, etc. "I'm probably doing this for myself." She's selfish insofar that she helps people to help herself, to better understand herself, to better understand her former comrades and how she really felt about their journey and particular relationships, and to satisfy her hobby of collecting spells, some subtly related to her comrades, some helpful in fulfilling her own responsibility, and some likely whims. In episode 3, when Fern asks Frieren if this journey has a purpose, she responds, "Not particularly. I'm satisfying my desire to collect spells, but whenever possible, I'd like to retrace the adventures I had with Himel and the others before all sign of them fades away." When asked if that's something important to her, she responds, "I don't know, so I'm trying to figure that out." Whether she even realizes how much of her journey is meant to help better understand herself and her comrades is at once thematically and subtextually fairly clear, but also textually and literally speaking, relatively ambiguous.
Stop. What do you mean by that?
But I honestly really like it that way. I could talk a bit more about some of the other characters, but I feel much of that would be premature, given the format of the story and where it's at currently. Also, this video is already growing far out of its originally intended scope. Let's instead talk a bit about the visuals. The show is absolutely beautiful, though perhaps not as dynamic in terms of moment-to-moment camera work as some of the shows which have spoiled us rotten recently.
2 weeks later.
I love the show's sense of style and the expressiveness of its characters. As you can pretty much always expect from Studio Madhouse, there are also plenty of awesome parallax camera effects. Those little moments where you'll see different layers moving across the screen at different speeds, creating a greater sense of dynamism in the environment, slowly revealing the full extent of said layers, or warping and wrapping around the subject to create a cool sense of tension. There are also lots of nice tracking shots where the camera, for example, spins around the subject. More than any of that though, I'm just totally in love with this show's aesthetic. It's full of painterly backgrounds and grainy textures, which actually are, once again, somewhat reminiscent of recent Mushoku Tensei content. The colors are fairly minimalistic but vibrant. Scenes that are dynamic concerning things like camera movement are still super stylish, and the environment itself is often dynamic enough to make the world feel alive all by itself. I also didn't notice an ounce of CG. The magic effects could easily be exceptions to that, but I'm not going to pretend that I noticed or cared. The show is freaking beautiful, and we will have been blessed if it continues to hold up to this level of style and production quality long term. Before finishing up the script, I decided to rewatch the first episode, and there are definitely some interesting things that were nicely reframed on my second viewing. The show actually opens up with the key quotes from Flam the Legendary Mage, foreshadowing the fourth episode and hinting at the quote, "land where souls rest," and the idea of communicating with said souls. Also, after seeing Frieren getting eaten by the mimic once again, I couldn't help but think of how fitting it actually is as a joke, specifically for her. She was likely rash to open the chest at the slightest chance that she might find some clue to a hidden spell in it, or at least that's my interpretation. The way she seemed so surprised by Fern upon their first meeting, I interpreted this time as being surprised by Fern's invisibility, or her expert control of her mana, something which she doesn't actually comment on until later in the show. I also really enjoy the way the characterization of her comrades slowly unfolds, and I think it's another element that will continue to help reframe things interestingly upon rewatches. There's honestly a ton of other stuff I'd like to talk about, so let's blaze through a couple of key points. The OST is really nice, though it is essentially just what you'd expect. Lots of orchestral fantasy music. I didn't feel much of it really stuck out during my first viewing, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think I was just too busy taking in the story to notice much of it, as some of the swells were really breathtaking upon reviewing. Many scenes also don't have any music at all, and are instead filled with Foley nature sounds, rain, wind, animals, etc. Something I really appreciate that I don't think a lot of anime get right. Much like the first time-lapse, subtly presenting our first journey's lengthy passage of time, there are many more wonderful montages made up of music and visuals only. I just absolutely love these in anime. Call of the Night is another one that I think used these to great effect fairly recently. More of this in all anime, please. No talking necessary. Just characters I love doing cool stuff set to vibe and music. ED is indeed better than OP, and I do think it fits the show better in general. But as for the excessive complaints about the OP being by Yoasobi, really people? Some of y'all be nitpicking on a whole new level, and that's coming from a professional nitpicker.
Stop!
Editor's note. Yeah, pretty ironic after a supposed lightning round, huh? No spoilers, but as someone who values setting proper expectations, now that I've watched 8 episodes, I feel obligated to expand upon a few things. Firstly, admitting that the folks who were saying, "Everyone's getting this wrong, Frieren is not really a tragedy," did kinda have a point. That's not to say that there are no more tragic elements present in the story thus far. They definitely still exist within some of the flashbacks, as well as within the world building and lore surrounding demons and the like. But they have definitely faded into the background as the story has progressed, at least for now. As for the idea that this story basically turns into a cookie-cutter shonen fighting show as soon as the main male character joins the party, I don't think that's true at all. Don't get me wrong, there's a reason this series has the shonen tag, but to call it a typical shonen seems pretty silly. Perhaps I've just been starved for good fantasy anime, and perhaps much of that feeling simply comes from the excellent presentation in animation, direction, and sound design. But I'm looking at episode 9 coming up this Friday, and I simply could not be more excited for the continuation of what I think has been a really unique and diverse experience thus far.
2 days later.
Bro! Bro! I'm gonna pass out! I'm gonna pass out! Bro! Bro!
There's nothing else airing right now that is even remotely like Frieren. And nothing that outright trumps my excitement for new episodes of it, even with so much exciting stuff running. JJK Season 2, Undead Unluck, Shangri-La Frontier, Pluto, Spy Family Season 2, Goblin Slayer Season 2, Shield Bro but it's actually kinda good again, The Eminence in Shadow Season 2, Dr. Stone Season 3, that new Gridman movie apparently just dropped. Actually, a lot of these look interesting, huh?
唾液には殺菌作用がある。この程度の傷なら消毒液は不要。
戦え。
How does anyone have time to watch all of this? Speaking of time, the brisk but relaxing pace of the story has remained in place. Many episodes still feature basically 2 episodes worth of substance in terms of the number of interesting events that transpire and often even conclude within 24 minutes. You can tell this is true because many episodes' ad breaks still feel like they would be the end of an episode in another show, though perhaps that's just the episodic slice of life influence coming through. However, we're no longer moving through the story years at a time, with that particular sort of pacing present only in the prologue episodes so far. I've also seen a few people refer to Frieren as a typical god who doesn't understand human emotions type trope or archetype. I can understand why, but I do think that's also a silly complaint, mostly because the supposed trope is so well integrated with the theme of time and how it can affect one's perception and values. And isn't that what typically separates good and bad use of tropes anyways? A writer either understands how the tropes affect and inform, either melding with or subverting the themes present in a story, or the writer doesn't get it and uses those same tropes ham-fistedly and haphazardly in ways which unintentionally muddy the overall message and leave you wondering what said tropes were even supposed to contribute in the context of said story. Or worse still, feeling as if they unknowingly contradicted other thematic elements. I think this is a clear case of someone using that trope with a firm grasp of how to use it, without it seeming as if it were simply shoved into the story carelessly because, well, here's a trope that's proven to work for previous audiences, let's just use it thoughtlessly, or because it has a certain coolness factor. Hopefully I'm making some sense. I realize this is a contentious point among anime fans, but I don't want to dive too deep down this rabbit hole right now. The point is, tropes are fine as long as the writer understands them and uses them creatively so that they serve an intelligible purpose in the actual story and themes, or maybe just make me laugh. On a more philosophical tangent, I'll admit this sort of stasis or time capsulation of dated opinions may sometimes be a real problem when talking about currently airing anime. There's definitely more utility and accuracy in covering something that's out and finalized to a degree, even if that degree of finality is just one of multiple seasons to come. It's also sort of unfortunate that we're incentivized to jump on whatever is current in a frenzied haste to get one of the first big videos on a hidden gem or whatever out. Although perhaps this is the only way to get people to look away from the more obvious broad appeal shows to check the less obvious ones out. For better or worse, I've definitely been guilty of this myself, but I still think it can be a fun exercise, and I think a lot can be judged based on even the first episode of a show alone. Even if production environments surrounding many modern shows lead to inconsistency and what I have often referred to as the dreaded Sakuga slump, even with a show that might straight up subvert expectations or whatever, I still think, in most cases, there's plenty you can judge based on the beginning of a series, an overall quality of presentation, what style it's aiming for, what sort of themes and style of presentation its ideas will be approached with, etc. And I definitely still think that that can inform whether a show is of interest to a particular type of person or not. Or maybe I'm just trying to justify the week spent editing this clearly late video. I still think it can be useful and entertaining. I'd be curious to know what you think if you do in fact find this tangent of interest. Hello? Is anyone there?
It's time to stop!
I'm really enjoying the series so far, and ironically for how tragic it can be at times, I think this is a perfect example of one of those shows I would love to put on an episode of just before bed once a week. Anyway, I'm gonna wrap this up and get back to work on some bigger projects. This was definitely different than usual, a bit more low-key than anything I've done in a while, but I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments, and let me know what you thought about these episodes. Peace.